public transit, should it be free? This is a somewhat interesting and niche discussion. I think that a lot of times you hear relatively simplistic arguments. You'll hear like progressives on Twitter saying, well, it should be free because it's publicly subsidized, and there's oftentimes like almost like this sort of vague moral argument that, you know, people should be able to travel and this and that, and, you know, we should just have these things be free. But then you'll have a less than nuanced alternative discussion where it's like, should we even have public transit? No, we should charge for it. Congestion pricing, you know, we should run public transit like fucking Uber or something, right? Which is not particularly nuanced as well. And so, broad overview, let's start with Micah. Micah's probably looked into this the most since he's the most urban, local, institution pilled of the three of us. Micah, to the question, should public transit be free at the point of service? I am a citizen of the city, therefore I can use public transit as much as I want. Is that how it should be? Why or why not?
So in the world in which we live in the United States, the answer is no. This is something that's been discussed a lot in the city of Houston, and there's been a lot of exploration about the idea. And the conclusion seems to consistently be that if our goal is increasing ridership of public transit and reducing reliance on automobiles, what we should be spending every dollar on improving the quality of our public transportation system. That means making it more frequent, making it more enjoyable, making it get to destinations faster, and expanding its scope so that you can really get around the city being car free. While it is nice to pay an even lower amount to use public transit, it's a quite low amount today. It just isn't the case that that money is best spent on making it even cheaper than it currently is. And there is an unintended negative consequence of making it free. It's that people who are homeless tend to just house themselves within mass transit. Now, this is a very unfortunate thing. I'm sure that homeless people don't like to have to do this. They'd prefer to be housed, and that certainly would be the ideal solution. But in our cities where we have not solved the homelessness crisis, moving all of the homeless people, or a large percentage of them, onto mass transit will surely substantially decrease ridership and reduce the quality of the experience. This is something that's already happened on Houston's public transportation network, where our light rail very frequently does not actually enforce its own fares. And so you can see people will sit on there the entire day, and it can pose a safety risk and discomfort to people who are riding as actual commuters.
Okay. And Estia, what are your thoughts?
I mean, I think intuitively there's some obvious reasons to go in either direction. One is that if it's free, like there's just a democratic sort of, maybe egalitarian approach to that. Like this is the transport owned by the people. Everyone gets to use it. We all pay for it. We all use it. One other benefit is that you don't need to have stuff that involves payment transaction. Like every machine that needs to manage cash, every machine that needs to manage cards, all the infrastructure just goes away. There's just a guy on a bus and you get on the bus. So there's some cost saving related to that, even though most of the cost associated with riding, that's got to be like 1% of the overhead of running a bus service, 2%. Most of it's labor cost and bus cost, or the train cost. So minimal but real. There's benefits in terms of ridership if you make it free. Something that I feel is under discussed is that when you get in a car, it doesn't feel like you're paying a cost. But you are, like, your car is depreciating, you're paying for gas or electricity or whatever. And so you just don't think about that. And so mentally, that's a problem for when you want to charge something to someone upfront. There's a big difference between paying a quarter for something and paying nothing for something. One is, I got to get my wallet out. And it's just this thing in your head that makes you not want to do it. And if you get rid of that, more people are willing to do it, and they might be more willing to switch away from cars. So there's a real tangible benefit there. The costs are, like Micah said, you could have public safety concerns. I think there's also concerns. The most obvious one is that if you are actually strapped for cash, if this is the people's bus, but the people don't actually want to pay for it, then you might have really shitty service. So you might have really infrequent headways. That means a bus might only come instead of every 5 minutes, it might be every 15, maybe every 25. And then no one really cares how cheap the bus is because, they can get on for no cost, but they've got to wait 25 minutes. And that also sucks. So, if there's a trade-off between frequency of headways and cost of service, there's some balance between those. Now, that, of course, assumes that people aren't willing to pay for everything. So maybe if we live in a more lefty society, if we pass all of Joe Biden's wonderful tax proposals and we have another $1 trillion to throw at the problem, maybe it's not such an issue. But I feel like the argument is just very simple. Your goal is to try and maximize bus usage, train usage over car usage, because it reduces the amount of wear and tear on the roads, it reduces the amount of cost to society, reduces fossil fuel usage. There's a lot of benefits to public transit. So you want to do so however possible. And if that means you have to charge some people to increase the amount of money so that you can run buses more often, then you do it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I sit in a somewhat open-minded, I guess, place with regards to this question. Like, should public transit be free? I think that I lean a little bit more towards what SDL said, at least at the very beginning, which is that there's certainly intuitive reasons and like practical reasons to prefer either one. But I feel like either problem, like what Micah mentioned, a bunch of homeless people might be sort of crowding the subway or the bus station or whatever it is. Like simple enforcement of that kind of thing, I think is pretty feasible. Like at least at the very least, like when I hear about these problems in New York, where in New York we got all these homeless people and mentally ill people in the subway system, and it's unsafe. It seems like the general response to that is just to try and increase like security presence and enforcement of subways and things like that. And I guess the question would be like, is the trade-off of that better or worse than the trade-off that SDL mentioned of having all this extra infrastructure for cards and payment of those systems? And is it even the case that that infrastructure prevents homeless people from doing the same thing anyway? Like you said, Micah, people just don't, like, the fees just aren't enforced anyway, right? So, like, is the problem really solved by having a user fee? And so if the question is ultimately, how do we enforce this? It seems like it could be a problem either way. The reading that I've done makes me lean towards a general goal of free at the point of service public transit. Part of the stuff that I've read that makes me lean towards that general goal is that, number one, like SDL said, public transit usage just tends to increase when it's free versus very low cost. And intuitively, right, like I want people to use public transit. I don't want people to just not use it and use cars instead because it's bad for the environment. Some people will say, well, you're congesting public transit, like a lot more people are using it, which strains the system. My response to that's very simple. Obviously, just expand the services offered. If a lot of people are using it, that's a good problem to have, in the sense that there's a lot of people that want to use public transit. And number two, for every person that you cram onto a bus, that's one less car on the road. So you're decreasing public road congestion, right? So there's obviously almost a one-for-one trade-off there, which I think is important to understand. Another thing that I've read is that it seems like the health benefits of public transit usage are pretty positive, not only in the sense that there's less air pollution because less people are in cars, but also the fact that people have to walk to the train station or the bus stop, right? There's just more physical activity involved with using, public transit instead of just walking out to your driveway and getting in your car. And that's something that's worth sort of pricing into the alternatives of either one. I will say that I probably disagree with SDL. I think the difference between like low cost, high exemption public transit is probably not extreme relative to just totally free public transit. Like, yes, there's additional administrative costs, but the actual things that I'm mentioning, like the health effects and the effects on congestion and usage, are probably not that extreme. Like, for instance, right, the city where we have totally free public busing and a subway system and a transit line versus those same systems where it costs $30 a month and you can have corporate partnerships for lower costs for employees, and students are exempt, and children are exempt, and parents with children are exempt, and the elderly are exempt from paying. That's probably not a big difference in usage between those two and the health outcomes, right? So, if there's actually a real utility of the fee, like maybe it could make some sense. Like if the political capital just doesn't exist for totally free, but you can argue for the second system. I mean, just go for the second system. That's way better anyway. So that's kind of where I sit. STL, seems like you have something to say. Yeah, go for it.
Just to speak to those two things, I think you're right. If it's politically feasible, you have to do what's politically feasible to maximize usage. just sort of relating it back to the tax system we had before, all of us sort of pine for, well, what if we just had one big simple tax? We don't like having all these little tax instruments, which are like, well, our tax system sort of sucks here. So what if we sort of shore up over here, and that causes a distortion? So we sort of shore up over there. Just one big fee or just totally free is sort of nice in that respect. I just wanted to mention on the air pollution thing, before we got too far away from it, there are 40,000 deaths per year from transportation-related air pollution in this country. We don't think about it, but cars kill 40,000 people in car accidents or car crashes, really, because almost all of them are due to human error. But they also kill an additional 40,000 people, cars and trucks, just by shitting shit into our lungs. Like, you are the storage place for a decent amount of air pollution in this country, and that kills you. And that's bad. So, I don't know.
And the mechanism for that it sounds weird, but the mechanism for that is that it marginally increases a population's propensity towards certain things. Like, for instance, if you get COVID and you also have, let's say, a pre-existing sort of respiratory infection because of polluted air, well, you're probably much more likely to die from COVID, right? And so all of these things sort of add to your chances of dying for any particular thing if you have polluted air. It's not necessarily that you walk outside and you immediately collapse from, the general amount of pollution in the air. It just adds on that one extra tick for your probability of dying from any one thing that could be confounded from the polluted air that you exist in, typically speaking. I mean, obviously, in some cities, maybe you do just collapse from how poor quality the air is, but not generally the case. Micah, go for it, yeah.
Yeah, so I really think that probably the correct verdict to take is that it's just going to depend a lot on where you're at when it comes to your mass transit system, right? So like in a city like Houston, the frequency is like pretty bad all over the place. And the scope of the system is pretty bad. And the quality of the experience is not very good either. And so here we absolutely need to be improving quality, because we just know from all the studies that I've seen, that is the determinant. It's not the cost. People are not choosing to not go use Houston's public transit system because it's too expensive. It's already remarkably cheap. It's that it just doesn't get them where they need to go on time, and they got to sit at a bus stop for a super long time. Who likes to do that in this hot weather? Now, if you are a city that has a lot of like fixed infrastructure, I'm talking about like light rail, metro, such that there is going to be a certain frequency that's always maintained. There's a certain supply, and there's just not enough people in those seats. There's tons of empty, unused supply. Then it probably is worth it to make it free or cheaper than it is today, because you're probably not making that much money from these fares because barely anybody's using it. It's going to be there. You can't reduce your service frequency, so you might as well reduce the price so more people are using it. Right now, I think that one thing that I think we all agree on is that you should not be paying per use of the public transit system generally. We should move to a system where people are paying more monthly installments, like a subscription fee. It seems like a lot of places already have this, but like whenever there's no marginal cost to using transit every single time you do it, that reduces your transaction costs, trying to find your card, but also just makes the experience a lot more enjoyable. Hey, I know that I can always take the bus anywhere I need to go because I paid $120 this year, so I have unlimited access. And so I think
you paid for your Bus Prime subscription, right, Micah?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, right. And so like the question is, should it be low or should it be free? And I think in the United States, it should be low. It should not be free. But I can imagine there's certain environments, maybe you solve homelessness, maybe you have tons of fixed supply infrastructure of transit where making it free could be appropriate, or even for certain periods of the day. Imagine like it's late in the evening, right? You got all the trains are still running. You want to make sure people are not drunk driving. Okay, make it free then. That can make a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, administratively, that wouldn't be obviously very complex. The
you just turn off the system at 6. It's like that easy.
Yeah, or you could just stop checking for cards or whatever it is, right? It's just not a big deal at a certain point. Because I mean, the enforcement, like I remember going to Montreal at one point, and it was each of the buses just had a scanner. The scanner was just the card that you were given as part of your fee. I believe local universities had their student ID cards integrated with the same system, so you could just scan your card. There you go. If you didn't scan your card, you just try to walk in like an asshole. Well, the bus driver would say, excuse me, good sir, you did not scan anything, and I'm going to need you to leave, or I'm going to call the Mounties on you. And that's pretty much how it was enforced, right? So it's not exactly a incredibly difficult, like administratively complex system. And I don't really know. I mean, Micah, you'd probably know more about me. Like, I don't know how it doesn't seem like there's as much of this sort of like federal, like a lot of people worry about things like this because in the federal government, Republicans actually literally try to make administrative efficiency worse in like all aspects of government service. I haven't seen that as much at the local level. At least like when I see politicians talking about things and ideas, it's basically always motivated. How do we deliver city services in the cheapest, most efficient way? Now, some ideas are worse than others, but there doesn't seem to be like a motivation to make city services worse, if that makes any sense.
Well, they just don't want to spend money on them, right? Just as you said, right? Like with the Houston Metro, Republicans look at ways to just take as much money from it as possible. Largely, arguably illegally, because the Metro has a designated retail sales tax that voters voted for, that it takes a certain amount of tax. And I think this relates to probably a separate topic we could talk about at some point. But like for public transportation, probably in the ideal wonk world, it would be something that's like fare free with a designated land value tax, because the land value tax will capture the effect that the public transit has on local land values, such that the system could be in a large way really self-sustaining still, because it's capturing the value that it's adding. One other thing I should note, though, because I know my neoliberal friends will find this frustrating, is that whenever you subsidize public services, their private alternatives are put at a systematic and unfair disadvantage. So if we have some really innovative way to provide private mass transit, such as the company SeatsX or like Uber variants, but that are actually using a more mass transit oriented model, they're not going to be able to compete with free. Who can compete with free? Right? They'd have to have a huge benefit in their quality of service in order to better compete with that. And so that would be a concern that I'd have with the free model, basically making it such that there's really no incentive for private firms to really compete. Now, what you could say is, what if we incorporate private providers into the public system? That'd be something I'm open-minded about. But I think that argument is worth acknowledging.
I don't know. Yeah, I was going to say, like, I don't know how resonating that argument is, because, like, there's so many local governments that have there's so many different public transit systems. There's got to be thousands of different public transit systems in this country. Some privately run, some publicly run. I feel like from a city level, almost like behaviorally, it makes sense that you could argue for a purely public system. And if the argument is, well, what about innovation? It's like, well, I mean, we can look at all the thousands and thousands and thousands of different public transit systems that are privately and publicly run in other cities. Like, we don't need to have a private sort of alternative, because we have all of these other examples and models that we can draw from. I don't know if we really need like a local production of private models.
I think we're talking about a model that we'd like for cities. We're not talking about just one city. I think we're talking about generally what we want from cities, right? And, usually cities are not great innovators for pretty much anything, because to innovate, you need scale and specialization. So if we ever were to see a huge breakthrough in how like private production and mass transit, it would probably be some like huge startup firm, like with ridiculous amounts of money and gobs of spending on research that like actually produce this. And in order for that to be supported, there would have to be a marketplace for it. There had to be cities where this could actually make money, right? And so like if our model was in place where it was free in all the cities, that'd basically make any sort of firm starting up in that area pretty much impossible.
I guess generally I would just say that I don't take it to be the case that even if we generally recommended a fully public transit system, because ultimately we're always recommending a decentralized public transit system. I mean, obviously, maybe there's some, there's some public infrastructure projects on a federal or state level, like maybe like big train lines and things like that. So maybe if you have a very small state like Rhode Island or something, like you could have a state bus system or something like that. But I would just say generally you could recommend, because it's a decentralized system, a decentralized public system, and just generally trust the idea that, well, New York's probably going to operate their subway a little bit differently than the other subways across all the other worlds, and we can compare the innovation of the public sector to the innovation of any potential alternative, private sector or contract or something like that. I guess I'm just generally saying, I'm not totally against like private options for public transit. Obviously, if we had private management or some socialists recommend worker management of public transit, like it should be cooperatively owned or something. But not necessarily against stuff like that. I'm just saying I think you could still rely on a lot of like model innovation from just the public system. Like for instance, if we were to compare like I don't know, public universities to each other or something, like, the modes of instruction and stuff like that aren't totally radically different from one university to another. But I think there's a lot of room for experimentation there that does happen. You can just cross apply any gains from one system to another pretty easily. But anyway, Estiel, what were you going to say?
I mean, I was just going to say that there have been experiments with like taxi systems, like Micah's talking about, where the goal is to try and focus on, rather than one person, one destination, multiple people, in one car to another area. And to some degree, that is probably actually worth subsidy. Like it just incorporating. I would love to see, unironically, some sort of city planner somewhere is like, here's the transit line that all these people would be taking to work. Could we pay them to carpool? Could we pay a company to get these people to carpool or something along those lines? Because like there's a lot of benefits to be had there of just driving one car versus four or whatever. So like I don't know. You're probably right that stuff like that should be incorporated. It is just it is much harder to run a let's micromanage people's commute to work versus let's just run a service where people can get on and off whenever.
Well, yeah, and that's why really, if you wanted to have a level playing field, you probably wouldn't introduce much in the way of like normal subsidies at all. You would just tax congestion a lot. Like you'd have tolls, and then you could have some sort of voucher model or a basic income, and then you just like let the market go crazy. Now, the concern has always been the politics of that, and also the administration of actually pricing road use, which is like, you need to have your carbon tax. You need to have probably some sort of extra pollution tax just because of that there's an external cost there in terms of people's air quality. And then you need the road damage, right? Then you need the market-based pricing of road use. There's a lot of administrative difficulties to actually having that occur.
And there's, the fact
just
that
congestion pricing. Sorry, go ahead, please, Econoboy.
It's like what you said earlier, Micah, as well. The fact that like if we were to implement all those policies in a city like Houston, where we don't have very high quality public transit, the politics become even worse, right? Because it's like, well, damn, like you're taxing all my car usage, but like the reason I use a car in Houston isn't because I'm some like evil person that just hates the poors on public transit. Public transit in Houston sucks. That's why I use a car in Houston, right? So you're kind of just taxing me and not giving me a great alternative. So the great alternative should probably come first. Similar to how like the question of should it be free or not? Well, when we have a quality transit system, that conversation becomes a lot easier.
And it's worth noting that to some degree, when you give people that alternative, they just switch automatically. There have been interesting studies looking at the introduction of Uber and other costs, like basically ride-sharing platforms, and they do actually reduce new car purchases and increase car sales and stuff. So like, I haven't seen studies on that with expansion of public transit, but I would assume the effect would be very, very similar. Like,
don't show that study to the libertarians. They'll never let us live it down.
I have many friends which literally don't have a car in this city. And they're in college, right? And they get around exclusively using Uber.
Wow.
Right?
I have many rich friends, says Micah.
No, really, no, not even all of them are rich. Some of them are literally migrant students. Like one of my friends is from Libya. That's how she gets around. Like it's really remarkable. But that's
I don't know how she affords it, but Godspeed to her.
Goodness.
I did just want to say something that has interested me a lot is that recently, I've been thinking about how a lot of American government functions are way more decentralized than they are in other countries. So our cops in this country are almost all run by the city. Our transit is almost always run by the city. And other countries will sometimes scale it up quite a bit. So some countries will have cops run by the federal government. You'll just have a hierarchical system going all the way down. The reason I've been thinking about this is that there's some evidence that local elections are way more biased towards the rich, the old, the white, the conservative. And so part of me wonders, part of the reason why there's bad politics on this, same as for turning out to zoning meetings or whatever. When you go to a zoning meeting, it's all people who have a bunch of free time on their hand and really care about local land values. And who is that? It's the old people with no job or who have a shit ton of free time who really care about not letting any new housing in their area. And so these are just a terrible way to govern zoning. And in my opinion, it's probably a terrible way to govern like policing or public transit, because who's turning out to city council meetings? Not the guy who's waiting on the bus. It's the guy who's got the car and a bunch of free time. And so basically, I've just wondered if moving these to a state system might unironically not be more democratic and open up more of the political options that we're talking about to just having like just having maybe a monthly tax payment or a monthly sales tax. I guess not monthly sales, a sales tax that is earmarked for this. I wonder if those would be opened up by moving to a state system, statalizing local public transit.
I mean, I think we organize at the county level in the state of Texas. I think that's like, it seems pretty appropriate. It's just like our hospital system, it's organized just because, like, one bus route is a pretty delicate thing. Like, you really need to understand where the stop is. You need to understand the conditions on the ground. It seems to me relatively difficult for a state level agency to have that kind of like that much intricate administrative labor attached to it for every city.
Why not? Like, if you just merge tomorrow the public transit authority in Houston and in Austin, and they have their two offices in two different cities, and they keep doing the exact same work, I'm just, I guess I'm less skeptical of the idea of central planning this kind of thing, but it just seems like you would just keep doing the same work, right?
Well, I suppose if you keep doing the same work, I guess you'd have like some sort of state appointment process for the leaders of all the metros, right? Which in Texas would mean they're Republicans.
Sure.
I guess the one benefit is you could have some like state level research on best practices. So you can maybe have like cross commercialization of best business practices. So I think that's cool. So long as like good people are elected at the state level. So maybe in blue states, maybe we could do that there.
Yeah,
I did wonder about stuff like, like when Economo was talking about, they've got ID card integration. Well, why not just have like a national system? You can get on any bus anywhere and there's one fee system, and all the state systems just have some fee structure built into like bus.gov or train.gov or whatever. And so, this one charges $1, this one charges $0, but it's all part of the same system. It doesn't seem like that should be, that's not too hard to do. Uber is doing stuff like that at scale right now.
If only we lived in a sane country where we could do relatively easy, good ideas.
Sure.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think that America just has so many political constraints, like both constitutionally and you could say like attitudinally with regards to sort of federal management of things. I mean, the FBI is already controversial enough, much less having like a federal sort of ground level police force. Obviously, in Texas, we have state police, right? And there is, as far as I'm aware, there's like state subsidization for forms of transit. That's why I say, like, I think that there are certain forms of public transit where I think that bigger entities have a more like appropriate role in. Now, certainly, what SDL is saying is that ultimately, at the end of the day, the management of these entities would be localized. It's just kind of a matter of almost like where you get the funding and the minimum regulations from. And so certainly I would say that it's something like a headcount model sort of tax subsidy scheme for cities, but where the funding comes from the state level, wouldn't necessarily be the worst thing. But like Micah said, it's going to depend on the politics of your state strategically, unfortunately, because if we had such a model in Texas, well, I mean, what would happen? Right,
yeah, sure.
we would just
it'd be cut to shit.
It would be cut to shit, and our public transit would get a lot worse across the whole state. I mean, goodness, like we had the state of Texas. This kind of got swept under the rug, but there was the Death Star bill, which I believe was actually passed, but I believe it's under court review right now. And the reason it was called the Death Star bill was because Texas Republicans basically authored a bill, which basically said that the spirit of the bill was that cities cannot propose regulations that the state has also proposed regulations for, which basically means cities can't propose any regulation, because the bill literally says the scope of city regulation cannot include economic policy. Like that was what,
nice.
And it's like, good God, you basically just.
Well, fortunately, there are so many policies which do not affect economic behavior, right? Like the broad swath of policies is what remains city power for.
Yeah, exactly. So state politics plays a role in your your ultimate decision there. I would say.
So in particular, I brought it up because I've been thinking about it in terms of policing, where a state level civilian oversight board seems almost certainly more likely to have more power than local civilian oversight boards, just for the same reasons that local city councilors are going to be disrepresentative. There's actually evidence on this that like local elections lean conservative, they lean older, they lean whiter. And that's part of the reason that our policies in this country are more conservative on crime than the average person desires. Like because of that bias is part of the reason we have like a more severe criminal system than we would otherwise want. And so, you know, it's just hard not to think, you know, everyone pays taxes, and some of those taxes go to state highway funds. And, you know, we don't all pay gas taxes, we don't all pay carbon taxes, but we do all pay money to go to the highway fund. Why is it that only a city can charge fees to go for its system infrastructure? It seems like these should just all be paid for by everyone, because these benefit everyone. Infrastructure benefits everyone, right? Every city person who doesn't have to buy a car is a little bit less road funding that some guy out in the sticks doesn't have to pay for. So everyone should benefit in the system.
I think intercity transit should definitely receive state support. And I think that relating to the police, it's definitely civilian oversight sounds good. State level police forces sounds incredibly scary. I want the guys with guns.
The local police forces are already scary and insane, right?
Like you want the guys with guns to be as decentralized as possible. The threat of fascism is much higher whenever one crazy governor like Greg Abbott can say, actually, all the police in the state are now going to be mobilized for this agenda. You know, a lot of the really bad bills that have been passed by the Texas legislature are not being enforced in many cities because they don't have control over our police. And so our police won't enforce them. Right? It's only state level police and then state police, which do exist, which are enforcing these completely awful laws. And so if all police were state police, we'd have a lot more enforcement of these bad things, right?
I mean, I think you're like, basically, I think you're right, but it always seems to be the case that you're right because the people who have the power will be using it for like awful, terrible reasons. But in any country that's like, in any state that's left of like the center in this country, it just seems like there's a huge problem with local police forces refusing to do their jobs. There's been so have you seen graphs of traffic citations in San Francisco, for example, or Los Angeles? I forget which one.
Yeah, it's like they've collapsed after COVID or something. Like nobody gets.
It's something
like.
Yes, it's something. There's like 1% as many speeding tickets today as there were 4 years ago, which is ridiculous. You know, the drivers in California have not become 99% better overnight. They're not all self-driving cars. It's ridiculous. It's just cops not doing their jobs because they don't agree with the local laws. So it's sort of the reverse. It's that cops are actively refusing to participate in laws they don't agree with. And there's to some degree, you know, you can argue there's a Democrat element to that of refusing to participate in unjust laws. But there's also a degree to which, like, you have to do your job and arrest people who are just like killing people with reckless driving. And it seems like that's less of a problem when you have the ability. Let me give one more interesting example of why this matters. In a lot of states, there is no central record of who has been a cop. And so what happens is some guy gets fired from one department because he beat up someone or he violated the nature of his role. And then he just goes to another department. And he's like, yep, I have cop experience. They're not going to recommend me, but I got a lot of experience in the job. And I hear you're really desperate for new cops. They'll usually go out to like a rural place where there isn't a great job market and they'll get hired. And so you have these terrible cops just constantly cycling through the system. And you don't have a way just to be like, no, you beat up people up. You don't get to have that power anymore. I don't know.
Well, yeah, I do think that's why I said, like, I think like centralized accountability seems like that's like pretty not scary. Centralized administration and like actual command structure seems to just like increase fascism risk so much so that like kind of any sort of efficiency benefits or like really anything else is completely offset, right? Because you know the threat of authoritarian, you know, a Republican governor going haywire and just deciding to use the police to enforce their entire awful agenda is just so much worse than any sort of benefit I think that could ever offer, right?
Yeah, and again, I guess part of ultimately one of the big arguments on this show fundamentally is sort of the capacity for good that the American government has, right? Like this was one of our arguments that we had on state enterprise in general, right? Was that it's like, well, a resonant argument from Micah, like one of the arguments that SDL and I made on state enterprise in general was that, well, it really depends on the model of a state enterprise that gets proposed, right? Because some state enterprise models are good, some are bad. There's a lot of sort of heterogeneity in the data, you know, your sample really matters. And some states seem to be able to do state enterprise well. Some states seem to not be able to do it very well. But at the same time, it's like the theoretical optimal state enterprise proposal exists, and you could propose that in America, and it would work. But in actually existing America, would such a proposal work? And so in actually existing Texas, would such a proposal work? Probably not, but maybe in actually existing Maryland, it would work, right? So, it's a because public transit is a hyper localized policy. I mean, outside of sort of federal subsidies and maybe grants for things like this, this is the calculus that we need to make. But anyway, back to the topic of should public transit be free at the point of service? It sounds like what we generally agree on, and I'm not sure if there's much more to talk about besides what we've already mentioned. What we generally agree on is that low-cost, high-exemption sort of public transit is kind of where we all sit at a minimum. And perhaps it is the case that once we have quality public transit, and perhaps when we have a more wonky tax system with things like congestion pricing and carbon taxes and things like this, that maybe at that point it makes a lot more sense to make it fully free. And maybe in certain cities with high quality public transit, maybe in DC or New York or whatever we think when we think of cities in America with good public transit, maybe in those cities it does make sense just to go ahead and make it free.